Reed Harlow stood in the dim solitude of his home office, the amber light of dusk filtering through the tall windows, casting long, broken shadows across the polished floor. He did not move. He watched as the horizon bled color into the sky, the vibrant reds and burnt oranges reflecting the quiet turmoil that had been building inside him. This estate, this sanctuary of manicured control and expensive quiet, was a monument to his journey. From a bruised childhood in Detroit to decorated tours in Afghanistan, from sleeping in the back of his car to leading one of the most elite private security firms in the country, Reed had carved a life through discipline, strategy, and an unshakable code. Loyalty, above all. At 43, he was the man that powerful men called when their lives were at risk, not just physically, but reputationally, politically, financially. Reed Harlow understood threats. He understood patterns, motives, fractures in the human facade. That was his currency and his burden. But as he stood there, eyes locked on the horizon, a feeling unfamiliar and corrosive was beginning to rise. Suspicion. Working late again? Vivian's voice came from the doorway, soft, teasing, carrying the practiced ease of a woman who knew how to say something without really saying anything. The sound of ice clinking in her glass followed, and with it a scent. Not her usual perfume, but something new, unfamiliar, different, deliberate. Reed didn't turn around. "Tanner case," he replied, his voice neutral, professional. "Threats are escalating." She crossed the room, her presence elegant and calculated. Vivian Harlow, once a sharp-witted paralegal with eyes like polished jade and ambition like fire, was now the glittering socialite wife of a self-made millionaire. She had adapted well, too well, serving on charity boards, curating fundraisers, forging connections that helped grease the wheels of Reed's corporate growth. She played her role with finesse. But tonight, Reed sensed something under the surface. Something discordant. "You're always saving everyone else," she said softly, stepping closer, her hand grazing his shoulder. "When do I get your full attention?" "When this case is closed," he said, finally facing her. Her beauty hadn't faded. In fact, it had evolved, matured. But beneath it, he saw something else now. A glint in her eye that wasn't longing. It was calculation. Timing. Moments later, after she had left the room, Reed's phone buzzed with a message from Damon Willis, his closest friend and chief intelligence officer at Harlow Security. Just 5 words. "You need to see this." Attached was a video file. Reed opened it, and within seconds, the axis of his reality tilted. No emotion crossed his face, no sound escaped his lips, but inside, something broke, and in its place, something else took root. Cold. Precise. Relentless. The footage was from one of his own surveillance cameras, unauthorized even to himself, planted by Damon. It showed Vivian entering the downtown condo of Blake Russo, their family lawyer. The timestamp aligned with the hours she claimed to be at her weekly charity board meeting. The second clip, hours later, showed them leaving together, close, familiar, careless. It wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. It was long-term, rehearsed, insulated. Reed played the video again. Not for disbelief, he had none. He was studying the pattern, reading between the gestures. He had learned long ago that rage was useless. Grief, paralyzing. What mattered was control. Reed Harlow didn't get angry. He got methodical. In that moment, watching the two people who should have stood beside him conspiring in the shadows, something inside him crystallized. Not revenge. That was too simple, too reactive. What he felt was colder, more precise. He had spent decades protecting the powerful from the invisible. Now he would turn that machinery inward, not to survive, but to destroy. And as the last light faded from the sky, Reed Harlow began to plan. Judge Larissa Vale sat motionless in her chambers, the late hour pressing against the windows like a silent witness. The room around her was dark save for the muted desk lamp casting a pool of pale yellow across the scattered case files and legal briefs. Her hands rested on a worn leather folder, Reed Harlow's confidential file, compiled and redacted in equal measure, resting like a loaded weapon beneath her fingers. For the last 6 years, she had presided over some of the most delicate federal cases in the circuit, and yet tonight, her breath was unsteady, her thoughts loud. It had begun as a whisper, an irregularity here, a suppressed detail there. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Then something closer to orchestration. The pieces didn't align until this case. The Russo investigation had opened more than just legal doors. It had cracked something inside her, a moral center she had long prided herself on guarding with quiet, unwavering conviction. But now that center trembled, just slightly, under the weight of something she had long refused to name: complicity. Blake Russo, legal counsel for Reed Harlow's security firm and a former protege of hers, had been subpoenaed for financial misconduct, but it was clear to Larissa early on that this case was just a surface layer, an engineered trap. It was too clean, too convenient. Russo's fall was not a matter of justice. It was precision.
Someone wanted him out of play.
And that someone, she suspected, sat behind the fortress of Harlow's security, watching, waiting. She rose from her chair slowly, crossing to the tall bookshelf that concealed her personal records. She unlocked a lower drawer and removed a document she hadn't touched in over a decade. Case D-117, the Darnell Incident. A classified military proceeding involving the unexplained death of a civilian during a covert operation in Kandahar. She remembered the face of the young officer who testified without flinching, whose version of events had been chillingly consistent and chillingly incomplete. Captain Reed Harlow. She had believed him then. Back then, she had admired him. A soldier with discipline, honor, and a rare emotional distance that made him seem incorruptible. But that same distance now seemed like something else entirely: the absence of remorse. A talent for masking intention. She scanned the document again, heart slowing as a detail she had once overlooked now surged to the surface. A name cross-referenced in the Darnell report was the same as the shell company that had wired a suspicious payment to Russo's offshore account just weeks ago. Coincidence had no place here. Larissa moved back to her desk, opened her laptop, and began pulling every ruling, contract, and court record tied to Harlow's security. What she saw began to form a pattern, not illegal on the surface, but engineered. Jurisdictions manipulated. Witnesses discredited. Evidence introduced too late to verify, too early to dismiss. A careful orchestration of truth and illusion, all done just inside the boundaries of law. It was brilliant and terrifying. She leaned back in her chair, eyes dry, throat tight. All this time, she had believed she was standing on the right side of the line. That justice, even when slow or flawed, was still real. But now she felt like she had been walking across glass, clear, deceptive, already cracking under her weight. And then came the final fracture, a sealed transcript, mistakenly unsealed by a clerical error, involving an ex-agent turned whistleblower. The testimony was redacted, save for one line that cut through her like a blade. He doesn't break the law. He bends reality until the law fits him. It was signed, Damon Willis. Larissa's hands trembled slightly as she closed the laptop. Damon Willis had disappeared 2 weeks after this testimony was recorded. Officially, he was listed as missing in action. Unofficially, no one knew. And now, the man he once served was eliminating ties, burning bridges, starting with Blake Russo. Larissa's chest tightened as her mind reached the conclusion she had been avoiding all evening. She was not outside this web, she was part of it. Harlow had appeared in her courtroom. Her rulings had protected his operations. Her silence had enabled his ascension. Whether she had meant to or not, she had helped build the throne from which he now ruled. She felt something shift inside her. Not panic, not fear, but grief. A kind of mourning for her former self, for the idealism she had once worn like armor. That armor was gone now. What remained was clarity. Reed Harlow had begun to dismantle the pieces around him, and she, Judge Larissa Vale, was next on his board. Not as an opponent, as an obstacle, an inconvenience. She straightened slowly, her breath shallow but steady, and reached for the encrypted phone hidden beneath the drawer lining. There was only one call she could make. Only one person who might still hold a piece of truth too dangerous to remain buried. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning. The grand skylight, typically bright with filtered sun, offered only a dull haze behind the frosted glass, casting a pale, metallic light on the polished wood and solemn faces below. Judge Larissa Vale sat at the bench, her posture as controlled as ever, though a trained observer might have noticed the subtle rigidity in her jaw, the tension in her knuckles as she adjusted the microphone. The silence before proceedings began felt unnaturally long, as if the entire room were holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The defendant, Blake Russo, sat quietly beside his newly appointed legal counsel, a woman whose name wasn't even printed on the docket until the night before, Elena Marlowe. She was a mid-career defense attorney with no high-profile cases to her name, no past affiliation with Russo, and no known political leanings. Her appointment had come through an emergency motion, approved quietly by Vale herself. To the prosecution, Marlowe looked like a delay tactic, a pawn sent to buy Russo time. But to Judge Vale, she was something else entirely, a carefully lit match brought to a room soaked in secrets. Elena sat with her hands folded, expression unreadable, as the prosecutor, a young but aggressive ADA named Malcolm Gray, rose to deliver his opening remarks. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed, laying out a case of financial misconduct, falsified contracts, and potential espionage, all allegedly orchestrated under Russo's oversight at Harlow Security. Every statement was punctuated by carefully selected evidence, most of which had been expedited through sealed subpoenas and protected informants. But Vale heard it differently now. Each word Malcolm spoke felt like the echo of something constructed, something curated to sound airtight, but built on invisible scaffolding. She knew this tactic, one she had once trusted. Control the story before the defense even speaks. When it was finally Marlowe's turn, she stood slowly, no notes in hand, no dramatic gestures. Her voice, low and unwavering, cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. Your Honor, members of the court, we will demonstrate that Mr. Russo is not the architect of corruption, but its most recent casualty. A few murmurs stirred behind her. Elena continued. This case is not about money. It's about silence. About what happens when one man becomes so untouchable that the justice system begins to orbit him instead of hold him accountable. Vale's breath hitched slightly. The courtroom didn't react loudly, but something shifted in the energy, a collective lean forward, a perceptible tension. Marlowe turned to the jury, slow, deliberate. My client was manipulated, used, and then abandoned. Not because he failed, but because he knew too much. And if we are to pursue the truth, we must go deeper than financial ledgers and falsified memos. We must ask, who benefits from Mr. Russo's silence? And what happens if he speaks? Judge Vale didn't look at her, but she felt the words as though they had been aimed directly at her chest. Marlowe was doing more than building a defense. She was opening a wound. Over the next 2 days, the trial unfolded with excruciating clarity. Witnesses testified with scripted precision. Expert analysts supported the prosecution's narrative with graphs and jargon. But Marlowe, calmly and systematically, dismantled them, not with theatrics, but with surgical insight. She would pause after each cross-examination, letting the silence drag just long enough for the jury to feel its weight. Then she'd ask the question no one wanted spoken aloud. Who approved this? Who signed off on these protocols? And why was Mr. Harlow's name never once mentioned? By the third day, murmurs had turned into tension. Court security had been doubled. Media presence was restrained, but quietly growing. Elena filed a motion to subpoena sealed military records from the Darnell investigation. The prosecution objected vehemently, citing national security. But Judge Vale granted it. That was the moment everything began to unravel. The courtroom became a stage not for justice, but for memory. The past, long buried under redacted files and silent complicity, began to rise. Elena introduced a witness who had vanished from the public eye for over a decade, Major Elijah Brandt, a former intelligence officer who had served under Harlow's command. His testimony was not explosive in tone, but devastating in content. He described operational protocols altered mid-mission, civilian casualties covered with manipulated logs, and Reed Harlow's personal interference in erasing internal dissent. Then he looked directly at Vale and said, "Some of us were trained to protect the country. Others learned how to erase it." Silence. Elena rested her hand gently on the desk, then spoke, almost a whisper. "Your Honor, if the court still believes this is a case about Mr. Russo's bank statements, I respectfully submit we are chasing shadows." Judge Vale didn't respond immediately. Her throat felt dry, her pulse deliberate. Every corner of the courtroom seemed to fold inward, collapsing around a singular truth she could no longer deny. Harlow had written this script long before anyone had stepped into the room. But now, through Marlowe, someone had begun to edit it. And for the first time in years, Vale felt something she hadn't known she was missing, the possibility of defiance. Not loud, not righteous, but earned. She dismissed the session for the day, gavel hitting the wood with finality. But as everyone began to file out, she remained seated, eyes locked on the empty chair where the name Reed Harlow was never spoken, yet omnipresent. The trial was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It had become something far more dangerous. A reckoning. It began with a file. Not the kind typically passed across desks in courtrooms or left forgotten in government archives, but a weathered leather folder, creased along the spine, smelling faintly of tobacco and sea salt. Elena Marlowe found it tucked beneath a false bottom in Antonio Russo's desk drawer, discovered during a late-night visit to the defendant's apartment, an impromptu search neither sanctioned nor technically legal. But legality was becoming increasingly irrelevant as the trial peeled back layers of performance to reveal something rawer, something older. Inside the folder were photographs, black and white, yellowed at the edges. A child, maybe 7 or 8, standing in front of a crumbling brick schoolhouse. The same child, a few years older, with a bruised cheekbone and eyes staring just past the camera. No smile in any of them. Tucked between the images were military IDs, foreign dispatches, clipped newspaper articles in Italian and English. Names scratched out, dates blurred. And then, one photograph more recent than the others. Antonio with a boy, smiling, laughing, perhaps the only image in the entire file where warmth lived. Elena stayed with the file until dawn, reading every note, every half-legible scribble in the margins. What emerged was not a timeline, but a pattern. Antonio Russo had not always been Antonio Russo. His name had been rewritten, once, perhaps twice. Born in the outskirts of Naples during the 1980s, he had grown up in the orphanage system, moving from institution to institution, until he was taken in by an American contractor with business ties to the military. His first recorded U.S. appearance came in 1999 in Arizona under the name Anthony R. Working in cyber defense training at the age of 19, a prodigy, they claimed, but more likely a construct. He had been groomed for it, trained not just in code and strategy but in silence. His fluency in languages, his uncanny ability to read people, his composure under pressure, they weren't gifts, they were scars honed into utility. Judge Larissa Vale, reviewing a redacted portion of the same file days later in her chambers, found herself lingering on one particular document, a psychological evaluation from 2007, marked classified in large red lettering. The doctor's notes described unresolved trauma response patterns, dissociative tendencies in high-stress scenarios, and, most chillingly, an ability to recontextualize truth when necessary for survival. Not a liar, a survivor. She read the file twice, then set it down, palms trembling slightly against the wood. The Antonio she'd seen in the courtroom, the composed, resigned man who never raised his voice, never interrupted, never defended himself with emotion, was not the product of guilt. He was the product of erasure. He had been used his entire life. By systems, by institutions, by men like Reed Harlow, who knew how to turn the wounded into weapons. And now, faced with the threat of exposure, those same systems had turned on him, not to destroy him, but to bury what he might reveal. Elena began tracing the connection between Antonio's earlier years and Harlow's private military contracts. The overlap was sickening. Surveillance programs Antonio had helped build had later been repurposed to monitor civilian dissent abroad, then quietly deployed at home. Whistleblowers had vanished. Reports had been lost. And through it all, Antonio had remained silent, because the moment he spoke, his entire identity risked collapse. Not just his freedom, but his existence. But perhaps the most devastating discovery came not from the files, but from Antonio himself. One night, after a long day in court, Elena found him alone in the holding room, staring at the floor, a tension in his posture that felt like grief held too long. "I didn't know my real last name until I was 23, he said quietly. By then it didn't matter. Everyone I loved was either dead or had orders to forget I existed." She sat across from him without speaking. "There was a boy," he continued. "Matteo. He was the closest thing I ever had to a brother. We were in the same ward, same home. We used to sneak out at night just to look at the stars, like they meant something more than just directions." He paused. "They found him dead 2 weeks after I left for the States. Overdose. But he'd never touched anything before. They said it was suicide, but it wasn't. It was a warning. Keep quiet. Stay in line." Elena felt the weight of it press between them, not just sorrow, but conditioning. Every choice Antonio had made since then had been calculated not for self-preservation, but for the preservation of silence. Speaking was betrayal, even to himself. And yet here he was cracking open. Not because of her questions or the trial or the threat of prison, but because for the first time in decades, someone had looked at him and seen more. Not a scapegoat. Not a tool. Not a ghost. A man. Judge Vale read her final docket entry that evening with a kind of reverence. The law, in all its rigidity, had no clear designation for the crimes committed around Antonio. But it could no longer pretend they didn't exist. Elena's defense wasn't just raising reasonable doubt. It was drawing a map back through a life rewritten by power. And somewhere beneath the pages, behind the code and the orders and the silence, lived a boy who once dreamed under stars, who once believed they could mean something. Perhaps now they finally did. The courtroom air was heavy, saturated with the low murmur of anticipation that always precedes the unveiling of truth. Antonio sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly on the table before him, fingers white at the knuckles, a silent testament to the storm gathering within. Across the room, Elena Marlowe prepared herself to dismantle the carefully constructed facades that had so far protected those who sought to bury the truth beneath lies and silence. Today was the day the shadows would be pulled back. She rose slowly, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of every sleepless night spent piecing together fractured stories and hidden connections. "Your Honor," she began, eyes meeting those of Judge Larissa Vale, "what I present today is not merely evidence of guilt or innocence. It is a window into a system that thrives on betrayal, on the erasure of those who dare to step outside its invisible lines." The first exhibit was a series of photographs, grainy surveillance stills and marked-up documents, showing Blake Russo in clandestine meetings with Judge Wilson, their smiles a stark contrast to the grim consequences of their collusion. Elena's narration painted a picture of corruption woven tightly into the fabric of the legal system itself, a system that was meant to protect but instead had been weaponized for personal gain. Then came the audio files, the turning point. Elena played the recordings, voices layered with duplicity and cold calculation. Vivian's laughter, Blake's scheming whispers, the intricate plans to liquidate Harlow's securities assets, and the cold indifference with which they discussed manipulating the very judge presiding over the case. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as every listener absorbed the betrayal in crystal-clear sound. Yet, it was not just evidence of their crimes that Elena sought to reveal, but the deeper wounds inflicted on Antonio, the man caught in the crossfire of greed and deceit. She called Cooper, Vivian's estranged brother, to the stand. His testimony was raw and unvarnished, revealing the fractures within Vivian's family, how financial manipulations extended beyond her marriage into a legacy of broken trust and hidden agendas. Cooper's voice cracked as he recounted nights spent piecing together shredded bank statements, whispered confrontations with his sister, and his eventual decision to come forward, not out of loyalty to Antonio, but from a desperate need to reclaim his own shattered sense of truth. His eyes met Antonio's across the courtroom, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, a shared burden borne by two people caught in the same storm. Throughout the testimonies, Antonio remained still, but his eyes betrayed the quiet turmoil inside. Each word spoken was a step toward liberation and exposure, yet also a reopening of old wounds, wounds shaped by years of silence, betrayal, and survival. Elena saw this, and her questions were gentle but incisive, inviting him to reclaim his narrative without forcing it. As witnesses detailed the financial trails, the illicit meetings, and the underhanded dealings, the courtroom transformed from a sterile battleground into a stage where human frailty met cold ambition. Judge Vale's face, usually a mask of judicial neutrality, flickered with recognition, the recognition of a system that had almost swallowed the truth whole. Finally, Elena presented the last piece, the handwritten letters from Antonio's past, uncovered from his forgotten locker in the orphanage, letters addressed to Mateo, his lost brother. They spoke of hope, fear, and a yearning for a life beyond the shadows. The letters hung in the air like fragile lifelines, reminders that beneath the layers of intrigue and betrayal was a man who had once dared to dream. The courtroom held its breath as Elena sat down, the silence a testament to the weight of what had been revealed. No longer was Antonio simply a defendant. He was a man exhumed from the depths of forgotten pain, now given voice through the courage of those who refused to let silence be the final verdict. Judge Vale leaned forward, her eyes reflecting a profound understanding. In this moment, justice was no longer a distant ideal but a fragile, trembling reality, one forged not in the cold confines of law alone, but in the messy, painful truths of human experience. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, the tension that had held it captive finally loosening its grip as Judge Larissa Vale leaned back, her fingers steepled beneath her chin in quiet contemplation. The weight of the evidence laid bare before her was undeniable, not merely the cold facts and recordings, but the human cost entwined within the deceit. For the first time since the proceedings began, a flicker of genuine remorse softened the stern lines of her face. Judge Vale's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the heavy burden of a conscience long wrestled with. This court acknowledges the grave miscarriages of justice that have unfolded beneath its watch, she said, her tone steady, but laced with a subtle tremor of vulnerability. I have come to understand that my role is not only to interpret the law but to listen, to truly listen, to the lives and truths that stand before me. Her admission was not one of mere procedural formality. It was a confession that echoed deeper than the walls of the courtroom, a rare unveiling of a soul grappling with the imperfections of the system she had upheld. The judgeship, once a symbol of unwavering authority, now felt like a mantle weighted with responsibility to heal as much as to judge. The room, filled with observers, legal professionals, and those personally entangled in the saga, sensed this pivotal moment. Elena Marlowe caught Antonio's eye, seeing in his gaze a complex mixture of relief and lingering pain, the beginning of a path toward restoration, not just legal vindication. Judge Vale continued, detailing the immediate steps she would take to rectify the injustices, initiating a review of all cases involving Blake Russo, recommending disciplinary actions against complicit officials, and most importantly, collaborating with federal agencies to dismantle the network of corruption that had poisoned the court's integrity. It was a promise not just to the victims, but to the very principle of justice itself. Yet beneath the procedural assurances lay the true challenge, repairing fractured lives, mending trust broken by betrayal and silence. Antonio's victory was not simply in the court's ruling but in the acknowledgement that the truth had been seen, heard, and valued. The healing would be slow, riddled with moments of doubt and pain, but it had begun. As the hearing adjourned, Judge Vale approached Antonio quietly, her expression no longer that of a distant arbiter, but of a fellow human bearing witness to his ordeal. "Your courage has illuminated shadows that too long went ignored," she said softly. "I am committed to ensuring that this chapter closes with honesty and respect." Antonio, feeling the weight of those words settle over him, allowed himself a rare, fragile hope, not just for justice served but for the possibility of renewal. Outside the courtroom, the world awaited, watching the ripple effects of accountability spread like dawn light breaking through long-standing darkness. In the quiet aftermath, as Elena, Damon, and Trinity gathered with Antonio, the unspoken understanding was clear. While no verdict could erase the scars left behind, the recognition and correction of wrongs marked the first true step toward reclaiming dignity, restoring faith, and forging a future where loyalty and truth could once again be the foundation of their lives. After the storm of the courtroom had finally settled, Antonio found himself standing at the edge of a new, uncertain landscape. The battle for justice had not simply altered the course of a trial, it had irrevocably shifted the contours of his existence, unraveling the tightly wound defenses he had clung to for so long. The man who once navigated life cloaked in silence and suspicion now faced a world unfiltered, raw, and terrifying in its openness. The days that followed were marked by a quiet reckoning. Antonio woke each morning with the ghost of past betrayals lingering like a shadow at the back of his mind, but also with a fragile flicker of hope. His apartment, once a fortress of solitude, began to feel less like a prison and more like a space where healing could begin. The photographs on the walls, faces from a past life, friends lost or forgotten, no longer haunted him but reminded him of a path forward, fractured but navigable. He found himself drawn to small rituals that anchored him, morning walks through the park where the interplay of light and shadow mirrored his own internal conflict, cups of strong coffee savored slowly as he attempted to reclaim moments of peace. The weight of the trial's revelations pressed on him, but Antonio was learning to hold that weight differently, not as a burden to carry alone but as a shared load with those who had stood beside him. Elena's unwavering presence became a tether to reality, a reminder that truth and justice were not abstract ideals, but living forces shaped by human courage and connection. Their conversations, sometimes fierce, sometimes tender, peered into the depths of Antonio's fears and dreams, unraveling the knots of guilt and shame woven into his psyche. She challenged him to envision a life not defined by what had been taken, but by what could yet be reclaimed. Antonio also began to confront the fractured relationships that had been casualties of the long years of silence. Reaching out to Cooper was tentative at first, but with each shared story, the barrier of mistrust chipped away. In those fragile moments of openness, Antonio glimpsed the possibility of a family rebuilt not on convenience, but on honesty and mutual support. Yet, the process was neither linear nor painless. There were nights when the past surged back with relentless force, dreams haunted by lost voices, memories that cut sharper than any courtroom cross-examination. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and Antonio grappled with the persistent question of whether the future he sought was a mere mirage, a fragile construct threatened by the shadows that still clung to him. In the quiet spaces between these struggles, Antonio discovered a surprising resilience within himself, a resilience born not of denial but of acceptance. He began volunteering at a community center, offering support to others entangled in webs of injustice, transforming his pain into purpose. The act of giving, of witnessing others' stories, gradually reshaped his own narrative from victimhood to agency. As seasons changed, so too did Antonio. The man who had once believed himself defined by betrayal now moved forward with a cautious strength, aware that healing was a journey rather than a destination. Judge Vale's reforms rippled through the legal system, but for Antonio, the true victory was the reclamation of his voice, his dignity, and a life no longer overshadowed by silence. In the stillness of an ordinary evening, as he looked out over the city lights from his modest apartment, Antonio felt a fragile peace settle within him. The road ahead remained uncertain, fraught with the echoes of the past, but it was his to walk, no longer alone, but accompanied by the truth he had fought so hard to reveal, and the tentative hope that from brokenness, something new could arise. In the fragile aftermath of the trial, Antonio found himself standing at the crossroads of his own fractured existence, where the lines between despair and hope blurred into a hazy, uncertain horizon. The emotional wounds inflicted by years of betrayal and silence had not simply disappeared with the court's ruling. Instead, they lingered beneath the surface like slow-burning embers, threatening to reignite with the slightest provocation. Yet within this tumultuous landscape, a subtle transformation began to take root, an emergence of connection, both to others and to the neglected parts of himself. The walls Antonio had built around his heart, erected as shields against a world that had failed him, began to crumble in the presence of genuine empathy and patient understanding. Elena's quiet insistence on presence, not rushing, not demanding, offered a sanctuary where Antonio could lower his defenses without fear of judgment. Their conversations, often unspoken, carried the weight of shared vulnerability. A glance, a sigh, a hesitant touch conveyed volumes where words faltered. In these moments, Antonio experienced something long foreign yet profoundly necessary: emotional intimacy, raw and unfiltered. This burgeoning connection extended beyond Elena. Damon, Trinity, and even Judge Larissa, each in their own way, became mirrors reflecting facets of Antonio's humanity he had long refused to see. The legal battles had stripped away the veneer of control and authority, revealing a man grappling with fear, regret, and a desperate yearning for redemption. Their presence served as reminders that healing was not a solitary endeavor, but a collective journey, woven through shared stories, mutual acknowledgement, and the fragile promise of trust rebuilt. Antonio's nights were no longer haunted solely by restless memories, but occasionally softened by dreams infused with possibility, visions where laughter replaced silence, where past betrayals dissolved into lessons rather than chains. He began to journal, a practice both painful and cathartic, pouring fragmented thoughts onto paper in a stream of consciousness that forced him to confront his fears and hopes alike. Writing became a bridge between his inner chaos and the slowly emerging order, a way to reclaim his narrative from the shadows. Spiritually, Antonio found solace in unexpected places: the quiet rustle of leaves during solitary walks, the gentle cadence of rain against window panes, the unspoken comfort of community in shared rituals. These small moments of beauty and stillness offered reprieve, reminding him that life's fractures could also create space for growth and renewal. The journey toward wholeness was neither swift nor linear, but each step, however tentative, marked progress. Amid this evolving landscape of emotional reconnection, Antonio confronted the lingering fear that had always whispered of inevitable loss, that trust would be shattered again, that love would slip through his fingers like sand. Yet, in acknowledging these fears without letting them dictate his actions, he began to cultivate resilience. He learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but a courageous act of opening oneself to the possibility of pain and joy alike. The process of healing also demanded forgiveness, not only of those who had wronged him, but of himself. Antonio grappled with guilt and self-reproach, the silent voices that questioned his worthiness of happiness and peace. Through therapy and the unwavering support of his newfound circle, he began to dismantle these internal barriers, understanding that self-compassion was essential to reclaiming agency over his life. As the days unfolded into weeks and months, Antonio's transformation became palpable, not as a dramatic, sudden rebirth, but as a quiet, persistent blossoming. The emotional scars remained, their textures etched into his being, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they became part of a mosaic, intricate and imperfect, telling a story of survival, courage, and the enduring power of human connection. In the gentle cadence of shared silences, laughter, and tears, Antonio discovered the profound truth that to heal is to reconnect, not only to others, but to the core of one's own humanity. It was in this delicate weaving of relationships, empathy, and self-acceptance that his spirit found a fragile yet steadfast renewal, illuminating a path forward through the shadows that once threatened to consume him. Antonio's journey back into society was neither smooth nor swift. It was a slow, painstaking process marked by internal battles as fierce as those he had faced in the courtroom. Emerging from the cocoon of isolation that had once protected him, he now had to navigate a world that felt simultaneously familiar and alien, a place both full of possibility and riddled with shadows of past trauma. The simple acts of engaging with others, re-establishing trust, and claiming a place within a community became monumental tasks that tested his fragile resilience daily. Each morning began with a quiet reckoning as Antonio confronted the invisible barriers that had grown within him over years of silence and suspicion. The reflex to withdraw, to guard himself against judgment and betrayal, remained deeply ingrained. Yet, beneath this impulse stirred a cautious hope, a yearning for connection that had been dormant too long. Small steps, an exchange of polite words with a neighbor, attending a support group meeting, volunteering at a local shelter, slowly built bridges between his internal world and the external reality he long avoided. Social settings were fraught with anxiety, the cacophony of voices, and the unpredictable rhythms of human interaction often overwhelming. Antonio found himself hyper-aware of every glance and tone, haunted by the fear of being misunderstood or rejected. These moments exposed the tender wounds beneath his composed exterior, forcing him to confront feelings of shame and vulnerability. Yet, paradoxically, it was in these very moments of discomfort that the seeds of growth took root. With each interaction, he learned to tolerate uncertainty and to accept imperfection in himself and others. Reintegrating also meant reconciling the fractured relationships that had been casualties of his past trauma. Contact with Cooper, once strained and distant, grew into cautious dialogues laced with tentative forgiveness and an honest reckoning of shared pain. Antonio realized that rebuilding these connections required patience and humility, acknowledging past mistakes without being defined by them. The process was slow and uneven, with setbacks and breakthroughs weaving together in a complex dance of human fragility. At the heart of Antonio's reintegration was a growing awareness of his own agency. No longer content to be a passive recipient of circumstance, he sought ways to contribute meaningfully to the world around him. Volunteering became more than a way to fill time. It was a deliberate act of reclaiming purpose and self-worth. In helping others, Antonio found moments of profound connection, glimpses of a life beyond survival, a life imbued with meaning and belonging. Therapy remained a cornerstone of his healing, providing a safe space to untangle the knotted threads of memory and emotion. Antonio grappled with the echoes of guilt and anger that surfaced unpredictably, learning new ways to sit with pain without being overwhelmed. The practice of mindfulness and self-compassion, initially foreign and awkward, gradually became tools of empowerment, enabling him to engage with the present moment rather than retreat into past fears. The legal reforms championed by Judge Larissa rippled through the community, offering Antonio a framework of justice that validated his experiences and those of others like him. Yet, he understood that true justice extended beyond courtroom victories. It was lived in the daily acts of rebuilding trust, fostering empathy, and confronting systemic flaws with courage. His journey became emblematic of this broader struggle, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit amid adversity. As Antonio walked the streets of the city he once avoided, he began to notice subtle changes within himself: a lighter step, a softer gaze, a willingness to engage rather than evade. The past, with all its pain and betrayal, remained a part of him, but it no longer cast an overwhelming shadow. Instead, it was integrated into a larger narrative of survival, growth, and tentative hope. In the quiet moments of reflection, Antonio recognized that reintegration was not a final destination but an ongoing process, a delicate balance of holding onto the lessons of the past while daring to envision a future shaped by choice and connection. It was a journey marked by setbacks and triumphs, by fear and courage, but above all, by the enduring possibility of healing in a world that often seemed indifferent, yet was capable of profound compassion. In the soft glow of a late afternoon, As shadows stretched long and the city hummed with a quiet rhythm, Antonio found himself standing at the threshold of a new chapter, a chapter not defined by the scars of the past, but by the fragile, luminous threads of hope he had painstakingly woven into his life. The courtroom battles, the sleepless nights haunted by memories, and the relentless inner turmoil had shaped him, yes, but they no longer imprisoned him. Instead, they had become the dark soil from which a tentative yet resolute optimism began to sprout. His gaze lingered on the faces of those who had accompanied him through this arduous journey: Elena's steady presence, a quiet anchor; Damon's unwavering belief, a spark of courage; Judge Larissa's tempered wisdom, a beacon of justice and humanity. These relationships, forged in the crucible of pain and perseverance, had transcended their initial roles, evolving into genuine connections that nurtured Antonio's spirit. In their company, he learned that healing was never linear, never simple. It was a mosaic of moments both painful and beautiful, stitched together by shared vulnerability and trust. Antonio's reflections that afternoon were not without melancholy. The ghosts of his past still whispered in the recesses of his mind, reminders of betrayal and loss that could never be fully silenced. Yet, he had come to understand that these shadows were part of his story, not enemies to be vanquished, but complex companions whose presence deepened his understanding of resilience. Embracing this complexity, he no longer sought perfection or total resolution but welcomed the imperfect, ongoing process of becoming whole. The city around him mirrored this duality, the simultaneous fragility and strength, the interplay of light and darkness. As he walked through familiar streets, once avoided, Antonio noticed the subtle beauty in everyday life: children's laughter echoing in a park, the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze, the soft warmth of sunlight filtering through worn windows. These simple moments, once overlooked or dismissed, now offered quiet affirmations of life's persistent possibility. Hope, Antonio realized, was not a grand, sweeping force but a delicate flame sustained by small acts, a word of kindness, a gesture of forgiveness, a decision to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. It was the courage to face each day with openness, to engage with others authentically, and to honor his own capacity for growth. This hope did not erase pain but coexisted with it, coloring his world with new shades of meaning and purpose. Looking ahead, Antonio felt a tentative excitement mingled with humility. He understood that challenges would continue to arise, that setbacks might punctuate progress, but he no longer feared them as insurmountable obstacles. Instead, he welcomed them as part of the rich, textured fabric of life, a life he was now ready to live fully, with all its contradictions and complexities. As twilight deepened, Antonio's heart swelled with a quiet gratitude for the journey, for the companions who had walked alongside him, and for the inner strength he had discovered. The path was uncertain, but the direction was clear: forward, into a future shaped not by fear or isolation but by connection, courage, and the enduring power of hope.